The winter silence settled over Oberkir like a heavy blanket on that December morning in 1944. Margarette Fisher lay still in the darkness, listening to nothing. It wasn't the ordinary quiet of frost-covered mornings, when ice softened every sound and even the birds stayed nested in the rafters. This silence felt different, heavier. It pressed against her eardrums and made her chest feel tight and small. She waited a full minute before it hit her. The radio from Berlin was gone. Every single morning for 3 years, at exactly 5:30, that crackling broadcast had filled the house. Marching music, news of glorious victories, reminders about rations and sacrifice and belief. She'd stopped really listening to the words months ago, but the sound itself had kept time like a metronome. Proof that someone somewhere was still holding things together. Now there was only emptiness. Margarette pushed herself up carefully, trying not to disturb Anna sleeping beside her. The room was cold enough that she could see her own breath forming clouds. Through a gap in the blackout curtains, the first hints of grey dawn crept in. In that dim light, her eyes found Wilhelm's uniform hanging in the bedroom corner. Mothballs and tobacco still lingered in the fabric. 2 years since Stalingrad. She still couldn't bring herself to put his things away. Downstairs in the kitchen, she lit a single candle stub. Wax was too precious to waste, but she needed light. The radio sat silent on the shelf. She stared at it as if sheer will could force it back to life, then turned the dial slowly through empty static. Her fingers trembled. Nothing, not a single voice, not one signal. The Americans had cut the lines. They weren't weeks away anymore. Not days, hours maybe, perhaps even less. On the table lay the children's ration cards beside a jar holding 3 potatoes and half a root vegetable. That was everything they had. 4 days since meat, 2 days since bread. Klaus had cried himself to sleep the night before, his small stomach cramping with hunger. Anna never complained anymore, which somehow felt worse. 14 years old, and already she'd learned that suffering silently saved everyone the pain of facing what couldn't be fixed. Margarette closed her eyes and saw the poster from the town square. She'd passed it every day for months. The image had burned itself into her mind. Savage American soldiers with bloody hands standing over burning houses while women screamed. The caption promised, "This is what's coming. Defend the fatherland." Every newsreel, every broadcast, every warning from the party officials who'd fled the week before told the same story. The Americans would destroy. They would take. They would show no mercy to German families. A knock at the door startled her. Forrester Wall slipped inside without waiting for an answer. Her grey hair stood wild, her eyes sharp despite the early hour. "You heard," she said. "Not really a question. The radio's gone." "They're coming today, maybe this morning." She set a small cloth bundle on the table. Flour, the last of hers. "We need to hide the girls in the cellar," she continued. "Burn anything valuable. Stay invisible. How do you know?" Margarette's voice came out smaller than she meant. "Because I've lived through this before, child. When Napoleon came through, my grandmother was your age. She told me what men do in war." Forrester's grip on her hand was hard and certain. "We do what women have always done. We survive. We protect the children. We make ourselves small until the storm passes." By afternoon, the women of the village had gathered in whispered clusters, sharing what little they had left, rehearsing stories, deciding what they'd say if questioned. There was comfort in numbers, in knowing they faced this together. Someone produced a bag of flour to divide. Another woman shared strategies for hiding jewelry in the garden. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people who'd learned that survival required both planning and silence in equal measure. Then the shelling began. Not distant thunder from the front lines, but close. So close the windows rattled and dust sifted down from the ceiling beams. Margarette grabbed Klaus and Anna, pulling them toward the cellar stairs. Klaus broke free and ran to the window. "Mama, look!" Through smoke drifting down the village road, she saw them. Sherman tanks, massive and mud-splattered, rolling forward with terrible mechanical grace. Soldiers in strange helmets walked beside them, rifles ready, faces hidden behind scarves against the cold. They moved like they owned the entire world, like nothing could stop them. Klaus's voice was very small. "Mama, will they shoot us?" She pulled him close, pressing his face against her shoulder so he wouldn't see her expression. "No, darling, we'll be safe. We'll stay quiet and they won't even know we're here." The lies tasted like ash in her mouth. She didn't believe them. Every poster, every warning, every promise echoed in her mind. The Americans would burn everything. They'd show no mercy. Anna was really watching her now, with those dark eyes that saw too much, and Margarette felt a cold rush of fear as she realized her daughter understood. For the first time in Anna's life, she could see that her mother didn't have answers, that being an adult didn't mean knowing what would happen. It just meant being better at hiding the terror. They huddled together in the root cellar as boots marched overhead. Heavy footsteps, voices in a language that sounded harsh and foreign. Margarette held her children and waited, counting her heartbeats in the darkness, praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. "Please, please let us live through this." The potatoes pressed cold against her back, while the house groaned as soldiers moved through rooms above, opening doors, searching for something she hoped they wouldn't find. When dawn finally broke cold and grey, Margarette woke with her neck cramped from sleeping against the cellar wall. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was. Then everything rushed back. The tanks, the boots overhead, the long night of waiting. Anna stirred beside her. Klaus was still sleeping, his breathing shallow and wheezy. His cough had gotten worse. Margarette climbed the stairs slowly, her legs stiff, her heart hammering. She pressed her ear against the cellar door and heard nothing. Carefully, so carefully, she eased it open and crept into her kitchen. The house was still standing. She'd expected ruins, flames, walls torn apart. Instead, she found muddy boot prints tracked across her clean floor, an empty wine bottle on its side near the stove, and a small metal kit for cleaning rifles forgotten on the windowsill. The Americans had been here. They'd walked through her home and touched her things. But they'd taken nothing. They'd simply passed through like travelers on their way somewhere else. She moved to the window, her hands shaking, and looked out at the village square. What she saw made no sense. American soldiers were setting up some kind of field kitchen, unloading crates from a truck, building a fire, and the smell drifting through her broken window made her knees weak. Coffee. Real coffee. Not the bitter acorn substitute they'd been drinking for 2 years. Her stomach clenched so hard she had to grip the counter. Klaus appeared at her elbow, his eyes enormous in his thin face. "Mama, I'm so hungry." "I know, darling, I know." She had nothing to give him. The potatoes in the cellar would last maybe 3 more days if she stretched them carefully. After that, there was nothing. Across the village, Corporal James Hayes stood with his squad outside the house they'd been ordered to search next. He was so tired he could barely think straight. Yesterday's firefight across the river kept replaying in his mind. The crack of gunfire, the smell of cordite. And worst of all, the German boy they'd found in a foxhole. Couldn't have been more than 16. He'd been holding a photograph. Maybe his sweetheart, maybe his sister. Jimmy had stared at that photograph for a long time before Miller pulled him away. Now Lieutenant Brennan was giving them the same speech he'd given every morning since they'd taken the village. Be firm, be fair, search for weapons and Nazi officials, but don't fraternize. These people aren't your friends, they're enemy civilians. Do your job and move on. Jimmy nodded, but his father's voice was louder in his head than the lieutenant's. His pop had fought in the last war, and before Jimmy shipped out, he'd told him something Jimmy couldn't forget. Every person you meet is somebody's child. Treat them how you'd want someone treating your mama if the war came to Iowa. They walked toward a small house with a patched roof and a garden turned to mud. Jimmy knocked politely, the way his mother had taught him, and waited. The door opened just a crack. A woman's face appeared, maybe 40, thin as a rail, with dark circles beneath her eyes that told of too many nights spent awake, worrying, wondering what tomorrow would bring. Behind her, Jimmy could make out a teenage girl and a little boy whose ribs showed through his shirt. "We need to search the house, Mom," Jimmy said, keeping his voice gentle. "We're looking for weapons, for soldiers." The woman stared at him like he was a ghost. The girl whispered something, and the woman replied, "9, no soldiers, just us." Jimmy and his squad moved through the small house carefully, opening closets, checking under beds. Miller found the uniform in the attic. German army, neatly folded, smelling of mothballs. He held it up, and Jimmy saw the woman's face go white. But it was just a uniform. Old, no weapons, no ammunition, no party materials, just the ghost of a dead soldier hanging in a widow's attic. They filed back downstairs, and Jimmy saw the little boy staring at him with a mixture of fear and fascination. The kid was maybe 8, and he looked like he hadn't had a decent meal in months. His cheeks were hollow, his wrists like twigs. Miller muttered under his breath, "Jesus, they got kids eating wallpaper past." Jimmy thought about his own little brother back home. He thought about the last letter from his mama, where she'd written about Tommy getting into the cookie jar and eating so many he got sick. This little boy probably couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten enough to get sick. Before he could stop himself, Jimmy reached into his pack and pulled out the Hershey bar he'd been saving. He'd gotten it in his last care package, had planned to make it last a week. He held it out to the boy, who stared at it like it was made of gold. The mother started to speak, started to refuse. Jimmy could see it in her face, that fierce pride that hunger hadn't quite killed yet. But the boy was already reaching for it with trembling fingers, already unwrapping the foil with the concentration of someone performing a sacred ritual. When he took the first bite, his whole face transformed. Pure joy, the kind of expression that made Jimmy's chest hurt. Jimmy smiled at him, sad and gentle, and turned to leave. As they walked back toward the square, Rodriguez said, "That was your last candy bar, wasn't it?" "Yeah," Jimmy said, "but I've got dinner waiting. That kid's got nothing." That night, lying on his bedroll in the common deeded barn, Jimmy stared at the ceiling and thought about the look on that mother's face. Not gratitude exactly, something more complicated, like she was trying to reconcile what she'd been told about Americans with what she'd just seen. Like everything she'd believed was cracking apart, and she didn't know what to do with the pieces. 3 days later, the sound of artillery moved east like a retreating storm. Oberkir was secured, which meant the fighting had passed them by and left something stranger in its wake, a kind of exhausted peace that no one quite trusted yet. Jimmy's squad had been reassigned from combat patrol to civil administration, which sounded official, but mostly meant dealing with the steady stream of refugees flooding in from villages that hadn't been as lucky. Women, old men, children with blank eyes, all of them starving. Captain Brennan was pragmatic about it. He'd gathered the company that morning and laid it out plain. "We feed them. I don't care if you like it or not. Hungry people riot. Full people cooperate. We're not here to punish mothers and children. We're here to win a war and go home, feed them, and we all get home faster." So the field kitchen expanded, taking over half the village square. Army rations lined up on makeshift tables, canned beans, powdered eggs, hard tack that could break teeth, corned beef that came in tins with keys that never worked right. Not exactly fine dining, but to people who'd been eating grass soup and boiled leather, it was a feast. Margarette stood at the edge of her kitchen, staring out the window at the line forming in the square. She'd rather die than beg for food from the enemy. That's what she told herself. That's what pride demanded. But Anna was weak now, sleeping 16 hours a day, her skin papery and pale, and Klaus's cough had turned into something deeper, something that rattled in his chest like broken glass. Frau Wolfs appeared at her door without knocking, the way she always did. "Don't be a fool, Margarette. Pride won't feed your children. I can't. I won't. You will." The old woman's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "I survived the last war by knowing when to bend. You think those boys out there care about your pride? They just want to do their jobs and go home. Let them." So Margarette joined the line. Her head down, shame burning in her throat. She kept her eyes on the ground, counting cobblestones, trying not to see the faces of her neighbors doing the same thing. When she reached the front, she looked up and found herself face to face with the young soldier who'd given Klaus the chocolate. He recognized her immediately. She could see it in his eyes, and he nodded, just a small acknowledgement that said he remembered. He ladled soup into her tin, a full ladle, not the regulation half portion. Then he added an extra piece of bread, wrapping it in paper and setting it carefully in her hands. He said something in English, and Anna, standing beside her now, translated quietly. He says it's for the kids. Margarette's voice cracked when she spoke. Danke. It was barely a whisper. Over the next week, something impossible began to happen. The Americans didn't leave. They stayed. And instead of the destruction everyone had been promised, they started fixing things. A squad of engineers repaired the village well pump that had been broken since August. A medic with kind eyes and gentle hands treated Klaus's infected cough with real medicine. Antibiotics that Margarette couldn't have gotten even if she'd had money. The cough that had kept her awake for weeks started to fade. Jimmy found himself assigned as liaison to the makeshift school the captain wanted to reopen. He needed a translator, and someone had pointed out the teenage girl who spoke surprisingly good English, Anna Fisher. She was quiet and watchful, but when she translated, she did it with careful precision, making sure both sides understood not just the words, but the meaning behind them. "Where did you learn English?" Jimmy asked her one afternoon while they were posting notices about school registration. "My mother taught me," Anna said. "She had books, hidden books. She said knowledge might save us someday." She paused, then added, "I think maybe she was right." The strangest thing was the baseball game. It started when Private O'Connor found a ball and a broken bat in an abandoned house. Someone else found gloves. Before anyone quite understood how it happened, there were American soldiers in the square teaching German children the rules of baseball, explaining strikes and balls and honors with exaggerated gestures that transcended language. The children's laughter was tentative at first, like they'd forgotten how, but then it grew louder, more real. Margarette watched from her window, and something in her chest loosened. These weren't monsters. They were boys, exhausted, homesick boys who missed their own families and were trying to do right in a world that had gone wrong. One evening, Jimmy sat on the steps of the common deeded house where his squad was billeted, reading a letter from his mother. Anna was walking past with a bucket of water, and he called out to her, "Hey, Anna, can I ask you something?" She stopped, wary but curious. "Yes? Your English is really good, better than good. Did your mother really teach you all of it?" She was married to a schoolteacher. She learned it when she was young, before the war, before it became dangerous to know enemy languages. Anna sat down the bucket. "She taught me at night when no one could hear. She said the world was bigger than our village, and someday I'd need to know that." Jimmy held out the letter. "My mum wrote this. I think maybe you'd appreciate it. She always tells me the same thing at the end." He pointed to the closing lines, and Anna read them aloud, her accent careful. "Be the kind of man your father would be proud of. Remember, we're all somebody's child." Margarette, who had come looking for Anna, heard those words from the doorway. She stopped, frozen. Something shifted in her chest, not quite forgiveness, not quite trust, but the first hairline crack in the wall of fear and propaganda that had surrounded her heart for so long. Christmas Eve arrived cold and grey, but for the first time in weeks, the village felt almost alive. The Americans had set up a scraggly pine tree in the square. Someone had found it half frozen in the woods and decorated it with whatever they could scrounge. Strips of tin foil, paper stars cut from ration boxes, even a few ornaments donated by villagers who'd kept them hidden through years of hardship. Captain Brennan organized a celebration, modest but genuine, with what supplies they could spare. An officer stood on a makeshift platform and gave a short speech. Anna translated for the crowd that had gathered, her voice carrying across the square. "We didn't come here to punish mothers and children. We came to stop a war. Now let's find peace together." Klaus got an orange, his first ever. He held it like it was made of glass, turning it over in his small hands, smelling the peel with wonder in his eyes. When he finally bit into it, juice running down his chin, he started crying. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sweetness of something he'd only heard about in stories. Jimmy watched the boy's face and had to look away, blinking hard. Later, Jimmy found Margarette near the food table and held out a can of condensed milk. "For the Hoffman baby next door," he said, and Anna, always nearby now, translated, "I heard he's not doing well." Margarette took the can, and for a moment her hand rested on Jimmy's. Just for a second, the briefest touch. She said something in German, then tried it in halting English. "You good man. I am sorry for believing lies. Jimmy's eyes grew bright. We all believed lies, Mom. We all did. Every single one of us bears the mark of it. That's what war does to people. For Oberkirk, that moment felt different, genuinely hopeful for the first time in what felt like forever. The village sensed it might actually begin to mend, that perhaps the darkest days had finally passed, and something worthwhile could eventually emerge from all the devastation. Children's voices carried through the streets, women's faces showed genuine warmth, even the American soldiers seemed transformed, as though the simple act of showing compassion had lifted some invisible burden from their shoulders. But in wartime, hope remains impossibly fragile. Everything changed when darkness fell that night. A single gunshot exploded from the church bell tower, tearing through the quiet. The bullet struck near the American encampment, and instantly soldiers threw themselves toward shelter, shouting commands and reaching for their weapons. Gunfire lit the night sky, and when the exchange ended, a body tumbled from the tower above and struck the ground with a sound that made Margaret's entire body recoil. Martin Kessler was just 17. He'd remained a Hitler Youth devotee until the very end, hiding inside that church for days with his dead brother's rifle, waiting for his chance to prove his loyalty to a regime that had already cast him aside. When morning arrived, the entire situation had transformed. The warmth evaporated instantly. American soldiers who'd been friendly just hours before became rigid and unyielding, moving through streets with weapons raised and expressions hardened like stone. Captain Brennan summoned intelligence personnel, new directives began flowing down, houses faced searches from top to bottom. People underwent questioning, and a strict curfew was imposed with orders to fire on anyone moving after dark. Someone had sheltered the boy, someone must have known about him. When Jimmy's squad appeared at Margaret's door the second time, the atmosphere felt entirely different now, formal, distant, severe. They proceeded through the rooms with cold precision, and this time they climbed into the attic. Miller discovered Wilhelm's army uniform hanging there, the same one they'd noticed previously, but now an intelligence officer accompanied them. A lieutenant called Shaw, whose eyes held no warmth whatsoever. He held up the German army uniform. "Your husband," he said, and Anna translated, her voice wavering. Margaret confirmed it with a nod. "Yes, he died at Stalingrad, 2 years past." "Were you a party member?" Shaw continued. "No," she answered. "Did you ever teach Nazi ideology to anyone?" "I was simply a teacher's wife, not a teacher myself," Margaret replied. "I stayed silent and focused on raising my children." Shaw wrote things down, posed more questions, each one landing like an accusation. At last he spoke again. "You'll need to come in for proper questioning." Margaret found herself escorted to temporary headquarters, a requisitioned office building where the Americans had arranged desks and filing cabinets overflowing with seized documents. In a bare, chilled room, she sat for 3 straight hours while Shaw examined her life as though cataloguing evidence. Party membership? No. Had her husband served? Yes, conscripted against his will, killed fighting in Russia. Ever report anyone to authorities? Never. Did she attend the rallies? Only when attendance was mandatory and recorded in official registers. The questions seemed endless, leaving her feeling completely drained, utterly depleted. Shaw finally opened his folder again and shut it deliberately. "You're cleared. No party involvement, no proof of collaboration. You can leave." But harm already done. When Margaret walked through the village toward home, neighbors exchanged whispers and knowing looks. Children who'd been playing stopped their games and fell silent. Even the usual greetings felt reluctant and muted. That night, Klaus posed a question that shattered her heart. "Mama," he asked quietly, "are we bad people?" Margaret held him close, but couldn't find words to answer. She'd never joined the party, never embraced the ideology, never deliberately hurt anyone. Yet she'd remained silent when the Goldstein family vanished from a neighboring village in 1942. She'd known it was happening, everyone knew, but no one had spoken up. Long after the children slept that evening, a soft knock came at her door. Jimmy stood there in civilian clothes, looking drained, his uniform appearing worn from the day. "I'm sorry," he said, and Anna hurried to translate. "I had orders for that search, but I reviewed your file afterward. You're completely clear." Margaret's emotional walls crumbled. Not because of the search itself, which she understood was necessary, but because she suddenly grasped something essential. She needed to be truly seen, not as enemy or as victim, but as someone who'd made deliberate choices and failed to make others when it mattered. Through Anna's halting translation, her voice shaking, Margaret spoke about the Goldstein family, about knowing and choosing silence instead. "I'm not Nazi," she whispered through tears flowing freely, "but I am not innocent either. None of us truly are. I did nothing while people disappeared. I protected my own children while abandoning someone else's. How does anyone live with such knowledge?" Jimmy listened completely, and when she finished, he answered carefully, pausing for Anna to convey his meaning. "My father fought in the First War and came home a changed man," he began quietly. "He told me once that simply surviving doesn't make you guilty. We do what we can with what we have available. You kept your children alive in impossible circumstances. That means something profound." Anna, who'd been faithfully translating, suddenly spoke her own thoughts aloud for the first time. "We cannot undo what we left undone, but we possess the ability to act now." The following morning, Anna presented herself at American headquarters before Jimmy had even finished his breakfast coffee. She stood in the doorway, spine straight, no longer concealing herself, no longer diminishing her presence. "I want to help," she announced in careful English. "I can interpret for the village council, for processing refugee applications, for whatever assistance you require." Captain Brennan glanced up from his desk, visibly taken aback. "How old are you exactly?" 14, she replied, "but I speak English better than anyone else in this entire village. And I understand these people completely. I can help you comprehend them." She paused deliberately before continuing, "And I can help them understand you as well." Brennan observed her closely for several moments, then gave a slow nod. "Understood. Report here at 0800 tomorrow morning. We have 200 refugees needing processing, and most lack proper documentation." Anna became the connection between two worlds. Her days consisted of moving between languages and cultures, translating more than mere words but entire contexts, clarifying why an elderly woman couldn't maintain eye contact with male soldiers, why families panicked at admitting Wehrmacht relatives, why simple inquiries about addresses and birth dates could trigger overwhelming fear. She remained patient with both groups, preventing small misunderstandings from calcifying into genuine hatred. Margaret observed her daughter's remarkable transformation and felt something shift profoundly within herself. If Anna possessed the courage to step forward, to abandon her hiding, then perhaps Margaret could discover that same courage too. The following day, Margaret approached the aid station the Americans had established inside the abandoned school. An American medic was struggling to manage a chaotic pile of refugee intake documentation and looked up at her arrival with visible frustration. "I can help," Margaret said, using gestures and the limited English vocabulary she'd acquired. "I can read, write, and organize." The medic's face immediately expressed relief and gratitude. Within minutes, Margaret was arranging papers, matching families to their documents, drawing on her teaching background to construct order from complete disorder. She worked methodically and without fuss, and when she discovered a record indicating a mother separated from her children in another village, she ensured that discovery reached the appropriate officer. By that evening, a vehicle had departed with orders to reunite them. These weren't grand gestures, weren't battlefield heroism, but they represented genuine action. It was electing to construct something rather than remaining concealed. A week passed before Captain Brennan assembled the village in the central square. Civilians and soldiers alike appeared, uncertain and curious regarding what news would be shared. Brennan positioned himself on the identical platform where the Christmas tree remained, now bare but still standing upright. "We've examined records," he began, waiting for Anna to translate her interpretation. "Documents we discovered in the municipal building revealed something remarkable." He produced a folder. During 1943, this village gave sanctuary to 6 French prisoners who'd escaped from a labor camp. You concealed them, sustained them with food, and ensured their passage across the frontier into Switzerland. The crowd reacted with audible murmurs of surprise. Margaret felt genuinely shocked. She'd possessed no knowledge of this. The residents had deliberately kept it secret, understanding the extreme danger involved. For Holtz stepped into view, her bearing dignified and assured. We performed what seemed correct, and we did so carefully. Brennan nodded, evident respect visible across his features. That's precisely what we're here to support. Individuals who select right even when it demands sacrifice from them. He surveyed the assembled people before him. You're not uniformly guilty. You're not uniformly innocent. You remain fundamentally human. You made decisions amid circumstances that offered no truly acceptable options. Certain individuals resisted through methods nobody will ever learn. Others maintained quiet when speech was required. What genuinely matters exists only in what comes after. His words descended like gentle snow, softening harsh contours, creating possibilities for fresh growth and healing. The military conflict drifted progressively eastward. By February, the fighting had shifted hundreds of miles away, and Oberkir functioned as a secure rear location, relatively peaceful. Jimmy's unit received deployment orders, preparing to advance eastward for the offensive's concluding phase toward German territory. 3 days remained to get ready. On his final morning, Jimmy discovered Margaret in the yard behind her residence, turning cold earth with her spade. He offered her a canvas-wrapped package. My mother sent this, he explained, and Anna approached to translate, consistently present when needed. Seeds, she announced, tomatoes, beans, carrots. Every garden requires a fresh beginning. Margaret accepted the package, her hands trembling slightly. Inside lay a letter composed in deliberate handwriting on pale blue paper. Anna read it aloud. To the German woman who reminds my son that goodness continues existing in this world. I thank you for proving to him that compassion survives conflict. Thank you for raising a daughter with sufficient bravery to construct bridges instead of walls. I'm providing seeds because gardens represent prayers we plant into earth. May yours flourish abundantly. Margaret pressed the letter against her heart, tears streaming freely. She expressed something in German, and Anna rendered her meaning into English, her own voice thick with profound feeling. Your son delivered more to my children than mere provisions. He provided us evidence that compassion endures through war. We thank you for raising him with such care. Jimmy managed only a nod, his voice failing him completely. He shook Anna's hand with formality, ruffled Klaus's hair one final occasion, and departed. He refrained from turning backward, yet he maintained the image permanently, them standing within that garden, holding seeds like promises, prepared to cultivate something fresh in ground that had known only scarcity. Spring arrived gradually in Oberkir. When May arrived, the war concluded, and word of it emerged not as festive celebration, but as modest acknowledgement and relief. Klaus and Anna planted the garden following the detailed instructions accompanying the seeds. Margaret observed from her kitchen window, holding Wilhelm's photograph. She would perpetually grieve him, yet she'd additionally never cease instructing her children in truth. That war represented wrongness. Silence represented wrongness. Yet small gestures of compassion possessed the capacity to restore what hatred had destroyed. The first green shoots emerged from the soil like genuine miracles. The sky overhead remained cloudless, containing no bombers, no fighter planes, simply birds returning northward and clouds that signified nothing beyond themselves. Oberkir would advance through slow healing, bearing its marks, its hidden knowledge, its collective guilt, and its modest demonstrations of quiet defiance. But restoration would occur because select soldiers had embraced mercy over violence, and select residents had embraced truth over convenient ignorance. Certain kindnesses transcend warfare itself. Certain gardens genuinely flourish from ruin, and certain truths understood far too late, purchased through terrible suffering, become the fertile foundation for something considerably more promising and more true.